The early hours of June 22nd, 1941, marked a turning point in World War II. Germany, breaking its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, launched a massive surprise attack. This operation, codenamed Barbarossa, unleashed the full fury of the Wehrmacht upon an unsuspecting foe. 3 million German soldiers, along with troops from their allies, surged across a vast front spanning from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The invasion, one of the largest in human history, marked the beginning of a brutal campaign that would leave millions dead and reshape the course of the war. The initial assault caught the Soviet leadership completely off guard. Despite warnings from intelligence sources, Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break their pact so soon. The Red Army, still reeling from purges and unprepared for the onslaught, crumbled under the weight of the German blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions, spearheaded by tanks and supported by Luftwaffe air power, cut deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The speed and ferocity of the German advance stunned the world. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing key cities and inflicting devastating losses on the Red Army. The invasion, initially hailed as a triumph by the Nazi leadership, would soon bog down in the face of fierce Soviet resistance and the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. However, the early successes of Barbarossa masked the true nature of the conflict. This was not to be a conventional war of conquest. Hitler envisioned something far more sinister, a war of annihilation against the Soviet people, fueled by his own twisted ideology. Operation Barbarossa was driven by a toxic mix of strategic ambitions and racial ideology. Hitler, obsessed with acquiring Lebensraum, or living space for the German people, saw the vast plains of the Soviet Union as ripe for conquest. He believed that the Slavic people, whom he considered racially inferior, were to be subjugated and enslaved. Their land, rich in resources, would be seized to fuel the German war machine and feed the growing German population. The invasion was also fueled by Hitler's deep-seated hatred of communism. He saw the Soviet Union, the heartland of Bolshevism, as an existential threat to Germany and all of Europe. In his warped worldview, the war against the Soviet Union was a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, a conspiracy he believed was orchestrated by Jews to undermine Western civilization. These ideological convictions, deeply ingrained in Nazi ideology, transformed the conflict in the East into a war of extermination. Traditional rules of warfare were discarded. The Wehrmacht, indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda, was encouraged to view the enemy as subhuman, deserving of no mercy. This toxic combination of strategic goals and racial hatred created a perfect storm that would unleash unprecedented brutality and suffering. Hitler's ambitions for the East went far beyond mere military victory. He envisioned a complete transformation of the region, a reshaping of its demography and culture to serve the interests of the Thousand-Year Reich. The plan, outlined in the infamous General Plan Ost, called for the enslavement, expulsion and extermination of tens of millions of people. Under this plan, the native populations of Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltic states were to be decimated through starvation, forced labor and mass murder. The most fertile lands would be cleared of their inhabitants and resettled with German colonists, creating a vast agricultural breadbasket for the Reich. The remaining Slavic population would be reduced to a state of permanent servitude, providing cheap labor for their German masters. This grand scheme of demographic engineering was rooted in Hitler's belief in the racial superiority of the German people. He envisioned a vast German empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, populated by a racially pure master race that would rule over the subjugated Slavs. The invasion of the Soviet Union, in his mind, was the first step toward realizing this twisted vision. From the outset, the invasion of the Soviet Union was designed to be a war of plunder. The German army, anticipating a long campaign, planned to live off the land, seizing food and resources from the local population. This policy, known as Hunger Plan, was not simply a matter of logistical necessity, it was a deliberate strategy of extermination. Under the Hunger Plan, millions of tons of grain were slated to be confiscated from Soviet Ukraine and shipped back to Germany, depriving the local population of their primary food source. Cities, cut off from their supply lines, were left to starve. The plan's architect, Herbert Bacher, cynically predicted that tens of millions of people will die of starvation. The systematic looting and destruction of Soviet agriculture had a devastating impact. Famine stalked the land, particularly in Ukraine, which had been one of the Soviet Union's most fertile breadbaskets. Millions perished from starvation, their bodies littering the countryside, a grim testament to the Nazi regime's callous disregard for human life. Section 5. A harvest of death, mass starvation and civilian casualties. The invasion of the Soviet Union unleashed a wave of death and destruction on a scale unprecedented in human history. The fighting itself was brutal and unforgiving, resulting in millions of military casualties on both sides. But it was the deliberate targeting of civilians that distinguished this conflict from previous wars. The Nazi regime, driven by its ideology of racial hatred, waged a war of annihilation against the Soviet people. Massacres of civilians became commonplace, often carried out with chilling efficiency by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that followed in the wake of the advancing German army. These units, tasked with eliminating undesirables, murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma and Soviet officials. The deliberate starvation policies of the Hunger Plan, coupled with the scorched earth tactics employed by both sides, resulted in widespread famine and disease. Cities like Leningrad, besieged by the Germans for over 900 days, became charnel houses, where hundreds of thousands perished from hunger and exposure. The civilian death toll, estimated at over 14 million, stands as a testament to the horrors unleashed by the Nazi invasion. Section 6. The Forgotten Victims, the Plight of Soviet POWs. The brutality of the Eastern Front was not confined to the battlefield or the civilian population. Soviet prisoners of war, captured in the millions during the early months of the invasion, faced a fate often worse than death. Viewed as racially inferior and ideologically hostile, Soviet POWs were treated with unspeakable cruelty by their German captors. Confined to overcrowded and unsanitary camps, Soviet prisoners were systematically starved and worked to death. Disease was rampant, and medical care was virtually non-existent. Those deemed too weak to work were often shot or gassed. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner by the Germans, an estimated 3.3 million perished in captivity, a staggering death toll that underscores the genocidal nature of the Nazi regime's policies. The plight of Soviet POWs stands as a stark reminder of the dark underbelly of the Second World War. Their suffering, often overshadowed by the Holocaust, deserves to be remembered as a testament to the depths of human depravity unleashed by the Nazi regime. Section 7. A brutal reprisal, Anti-Partisan Operations. As the German advance stalled and Soviet resistance stiffened, the conflict in the East took on a new dimension, a brutal guerrilla war waged behind enemy lines. Soviet partisans operating from hidden bases in forests and swamps launched daring raids against German supply lines, communication centers and isolated garrisons. The German response to the partisan threat was swift and merciless. Entire villages, suspected of harboring or aiding partisans, were razed to the ground. Their inhabitants were often massacred, regardless of age or gender. The Wehrmacht, frustrated by its inability to crush the elusive partisans, adopted a scorched earth policy, burning crops, destroying infrastructure and terrorizing the local population. The anti-partisan campaign, waged with exceptional brutality, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians. It also further eroded the already tenuous moral standing of the Wehrmacht, which increasingly resorted to atrocities and war crimes in its futile attempt to pacify the occupied territories. Section 8. The Holocaust Unleashed, Systematic Murder of Jews. The invasion of the Soviet Union marked a turning point in the Nazi regime's genocidal campaign against the Jews, the beginning of the final solution. With the vastness of the East at their disposal, the Nazis unleashed a campaign of mass murder unprecedented in human history. Mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, fanned out across the occupied territories, rounding up Jews and other undesirables for extermination. Men, women and children were shot by the thousands and buried in mass graves, often while still alive. The killings were carried out with chilling efficiency, fueled by a toxic mix of anti-Semitism, racial ideology, and bureaucratic zeal. The Holocaust in the East was not confined to the actions of the Einsatzgruppen. The Wehrmacht, despite its claims of clean hands, was deeply complicit in the genocide. German soldiers participated in mass shootings, guarded ghettos, and provided logistical support for the killing operations. The invasion of the Soviet Union exposed the true nature of the Nazi regime, a murderous enterprise bent on the extermination of European Jewry. Section 9, Legacies of Barbarossa, a dark chapter in human history. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on that fateful day in June 1941, unleashed a torrent of death and destruction that would forever scar the landscape of Europe. The conflict, fueled by a toxic mix of strategic ambition, racial hatred, and ideological fanaticism, resulted in millions of deaths and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the Soviet people. The legacy of Barbarossa extends far beyond the battlefield. The atrocities committed during the conflict, particularly the Holocaust, serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, racial hatred, and totalitarian ideology. The invasion also had a profound impact on the course of World War II, ultimately contributing to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the emergence of the Soviet Union as a global superpower. The lessons of Barbarossa remain as relevant today as they were over 8 decades ago. They serve as a warning against complacency in the face of tyranny and a reminder of our collective responsibility to confront hatred and intolerance wherever they may arise. The memory of the millions who perished in the East, victims of a war unleashed by unchecked ambition and fueled by an ideology of hate, must never be forgotten.